When my emergency radio crackled with a desperate distress call from a family on a sinking yacht, I thought about continuing my safe mail route and letting someone else handle the rescue. As an ex-Navy pilot who lost her wingman Paul in a crash 15 years ago, I'd spent every day since then avoiding the kind of danger that once defined my life. You won't believe what happened next. I never expected that saving 4 strangers would require landing my bush plane on the USS Enterprise, the same aircraft carrier where I'd lost everything, or that facing my worst nightmare would finally give me the redemption I never thought I deserved. Sometimes the only way to heal from the past is to fly straight into it and prove that the hero inside you never really died. Hi everyone. Welcome to Life's Changing Stories. Now let's dive into today's story. The cramped cockpit of the Cessna 206 Stationair that Alice Morgan flew for Atlantic Coast Air Services had become both her sanctuary and her prison over the past 12 years, providing the isolation and predictability she needed to function as a pilot, while avoiding the kind of high-stakes aviation that had once defined her identity as a naval aviator before a catastrophic carrier landing had ended her military career and cost her wingman his life. At 47, Alice had deliberately chosen the most unglamorous and safest flying job she could find, delivering mail and supplies to small islands along the Atlantic coast, where the most dangerous aspect of her routine was navigating occasional crosswinds during landing approaches that posed no real threat to her safety or psychological stability. Alice's past as a Navy fighter pilot represented everything she had worked to forget and avoid since the inquiry board had concluded that pilot error had caused the deck collision on the USS Enterprise that killed Lieutenant Paul Morrison, her wingman and closest friend, while ending her own career in naval aviation through a combination of physical injuries and psychological trauma that made her unfit for the high-pressure environment of aircraft carrier operations. The crash had occurred during a routine training exercise when poor weather conditions and equipment malfunction had created a perfect storm of circumstances that challenged her decision-making abilities and ultimately resulted in the tragedy that haunted her nightmares and shaped every choice she had made about aviation for the past 15 years. Alice's current job flying mail runs required minimal interaction with other people and provided the solitude she needed to manage the anxiety and hypervigilance that made civilian life a constant struggle against memories of burning jet fuel, twisted metal, and the moment when she realized that her mistake had cost Paul Morrison his life and his family, their son, husband, and father. The Cessna was a reliable, forgiving aircraft that responded predictably to her inputs and rarely presented the kind of challenging situations that could trigger the flashbacks and panic attacks that had forced her to accept that her days as a high-performance pilot were permanently over. The islands along Alice's route had become familiar waypoints where she could deliver mail and packages while enjoying brief moments of human connection with residents who appreciated her reliable service and the small gifts she brought for their children, including the mints that had earned her the nickname Miss Hawk from local kids who looked forward to her weekly visits. These interactions provided just enough social contact to prevent complete isolation while maintaining the emotional distance that protected her from forming relationships that might be threatened by her unpredictable psychological responses to stress and unexpected challenges. This particular Tuesday morning had started like hundreds of others, with Alice completing her pre-flight inspection, loading mail bags and supply packages, and preparing for the 4-hour route that would take her to 6 islands before returning to her base on the mainland, where she could retreat to her small apartment and spend another evening reading or working on the model airplanes that provided a safe outlet for her continued fascination with aviation. Alice Morgan adjusted her headset and checked her fuel gauges as she leveled off at 2,000 feet for the second leg of her mail delivery route, following the same flight path she had flown twice weekly for over a decade, while serving the small island communities that depended on Atlantic coast air services for mail, medical supplies, and the occasional emergency transport that represented the most excitement her job typically provided. At 47, Alice had found a measure of peace in the predictable rhythms of coastal flying, where the most challenging aspect of her routine involved landing on short airstrips during crosswind conditions that posed no real threat to her safety or the psychological stability she had worked so hard to maintain. The Cessna 206 Stationair responded to Alice's inputs with the reliability and forgiveness that had made it the perfect aircraft for her transition from military to civilian aviation, providing the performance she needed for island operations while lacking the complexity and high-stakes environment that had once attracted her to naval aviation before everything had gone wrong during a training exercise that changed the course of her life forever. Alice's emergency radio had been silent for most of the morning, carrying only the routine chatter between commercial aircraft and air traffic control centers that coordinated the busy airspace along the Atlantic shipping lanes. However, as she was approaching the halfway point of her route, the radio suddenly crackled with a transmission that immediately captured her attention due to its urgency and obvious distress. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," came a weak but desperate voice through the static. "This is the sailing vessel Seabird out of Norfolk, Virginia. We have struck a reef and are taking on water rapidly. Request immediate assistance." Alice turned up her radio volume and began monitoring the frequency as the distress call grew stronger and more detailed, indicating that the vessel was closer to her position than to any established rescue facilities or Coast Guard stations that could provide immediate assistance. "Seabird to any station. We have 2 adults and 2 children on board," the voice continued, fighting against increasing static and background noise that suggested deteriorating weather conditions. "Our GPS and satellite phone were damaged when we hit the reef. We're deploying life rafts and requesting immediate rescue assistance." A younger voice, clearly that of a frightened child, could be heard in the background asking, "Are we going to be okay?" While an adult voice tried to provide reassurance despite obvious stress and fear about their situation. Alice felt her heart rate increasing as she processed the implications of what she was hearing, recognizing that a family with children was facing a life-threatening emergency in conditions that would make rescue operations extremely dangerous for both the survivors and any aircraft or vessels that attempted to provide assistance. "Seabird, this is Cessna 206 Alpha Charlie 6, Alice transmitted, knowing that she might be the only pilot in range to respond to their distress call. "I copy your mayday. Please confirm your current position and status of your vessel." "We're approximately 180 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras," came the response, with coordinates that Alice quickly plotted on her navigation chart. "The boat is going down fast. We've got the life raft ready, but the weather is getting worse, and we can see a major storm system moving in from the east." Alice calculated the distance to the survivors' position and realized that reaching them would require flying directly into the approaching storm system that was creating increasingly dangerous conditions for both the family in distress and any rescue aircraft that attempted to provide assistance. Her fuel situation was manageable, 3/4 full with enough range to reach the area, but there were no suitable landing areas within safe flying distance if she diverted from her planned route to investigate the emergency. As Alice studied her charts and considered her options, she noticed that the USS Enterprise, the same aircraft carrier where she had crashed 15 years earlier, and lost her wingman Paul Morrison was currently conducting training exercises approximately 120 miles northwest of the distress call's coordinates. The Enterprise represented both her greatest failure and potentially the only platform capable of supporting a rescue operation in the deteriorating weather conditions that were making helicopter operations from shore-based facilities increasingly impossible. Alice had minutes to make a decision that would either condemn the family to almost certain death or require her to confront the most traumatic experience of her life by attempting to land on the carrier deck where Paul had died because of her mistakes. The voice of a small boy came through the radio crying, "Please help us, we're scared," and Alice felt her resolve crystallize as she banked sharply southeast and pushed her throttle forward, choosing to save 4 lives regardless of the personal cost or the demons she would have to face. Flying into the storm system felt like entering a dark wall of turbulence, rain, and lightning that tested every aspect of Alice's flying skills, while the Cessna bucked and pitched in conditions that would have grounded most civilian aircraft. Alice relied on instruments and instinct developed during years of carrier operations to maintain control while fighting through weather that reminded her of the night Paul had died trying to land in similar conditions. After 45 minutes of battling the storm, Alice reduced her altitude to 1,000 feet and began searching for any sign of the survivors in mountainous seas that made visual identification nearly impossible. On her third search pattern, she spotted a flash of orange, a life raft rising and falling on massive waves with 4 figures huddled inside, clearly alive, but struggling against conditions that would kill them within hours. Alice dropped a waterproof GPS beacon and emergency flare near the raft, watching as the flare ignited and one of the adults waved frantically to acknowledge her presence. With her fuel running critically low and no other rescue options available, Alice committed the raft's exact position to memory and headed northwest toward the USS Enterprise, knowing that the Navy needed eyes on target to guide rescue helicopters to the survivors' location. When Alice made contact with the Enterprise on an old Navy frequency, the initial response was hostile and dismissive, with the bridge ordering her to alter course and warning that she was approaching restricted military airspace during active training operations. "This is Alice Morgan, former Lieutenant United States Navy, call sign Storm Hawk," Alice transmitted, using her old military credentials to establish credibility. "I have visual confirmation of 4 survivors from the sailing vessel Seabird at these coordinates. 2 adults and 2 children in a life raft, requiring immediate rescue before the storm kills them." Captain Thomas Richardson, the Enterprise's commanding officer, who had been a lieutenant commander during Alice's time in naval aviation, took over the radio communication with obvious disbelief about Alice's proposal to land a civilian aircraft on his carrier deck without arrestor gear or the specialized equipment required for carrier operations. "Morgan, that's suicide," Captain Richardson said bluntly. "You're talking about landing a civilian aircraft without a tailhook or arrest cables. This isn't a training exercise. This is an active carrier with no accommodation for civilian operations." "I'm former carrier qualified," Alice replied firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made hundreds of successful carrier landings before the crash that ended her career. "This aircraft can land in under 200 feet, my fuel is critical, and those survivors need rescue immediately. I'm not requesting authorization, Captain. I'm informing you that I'm landing on your deck in approximately 6 minutes." Captain Richardson remembered Alice's past crash on the Enterprise and the inquiry that had ended her career, creating obvious reluctance to authorize another potentially catastrophic landing attempt by a pilot whose last carrier operation had resulted in death and destruction. "This time, I'm not trying to save myself, Captain. Alice said quietly. "I'm trying to save them." After a tense pause, Captain Richardson reluctantly authorized Alice's landing approach while warning that any deviation from safe procedures would result in her aircraft being shot down, and that he would face a court-martial if the landing resulted in casualties or damage to his ship. The landing signal officer guided Alice through her approach, providing wind speed data, 30 knots, deck movement information, 10 to 12 feet of pitch, and confirmation that crash barriers had been deployed to stop her aircraft if normal braking proved insufficient. Alice lined up for her final approach, relying on 15-year-old training and muscle memory while fighting against weather conditions that made the carrier deck a moving target in heavy seas. She called the ball to indicate visual contact with the carrier's guidance lights, then reduced power and focused entirely on the pitching deck while remembering that her previous crash had been caused by approaching too fast and failing to compensate for the carrier's movement. As Alice crossed the stern of the Enterprise, she cut power completely and felt her aircraft contact the deck with a solid impact that confirmed successful touchdown despite the challenging conditions. Without arrestor cables to stop her forward momentum, Alice relied on brakes and reverse propeller thrust, while the wet deck caused her aircraft to skid sideways with its tail swinging dangerously close to the ship's superstructure. Sailors deployed emergency barrier nets as Alice's aircraft continued sliding toward the edge of the deck, finally stopping with her nose hanging precariously over the side and her propeller spinning just feet above the churning ocean. Against all odds and expectations, Alice had successfully landed on the Enterprise and was ready to coordinate the rescue operation that would save 4 lives. Commander Lisa Torres, who had been Paul Morrison's best friend and had testified against Alice during the inquiry board proceedings, approached the aircraft with obvious skepticism about Alice's motives and capabilities. "I need immediate helicopter launch to these coordinates," Alice said, providing the exact location of the survivors, while Torres's expression shifted from suspicion to grudging respect for the impossible landing Alice had just accomplished. "If you're lying about those survivors, you'll face criminal charges," Torres warned, while ordering helicopter crews to prepare for launch operations in dangerous weather conditions. Alice was escorted to the Enterprise's Combat Information Center to monitor radio communications from the rescue helicopter as it fought through storm conditions to reach the coordinates she had provided. Captain Richardson joined her in the CIC, expressing his displeasure about the unauthorized landing, while acknowledging that Alice had accomplished something that most pilots would have considered impossible. After tense minutes of radio silence, the helicopter pilot reported flare sightings and visual confirmation of the life raft with 4 survivors, triggering spontaneous cheers throughout the CIC as rescue crews prepared to extract the family from conditions that would have killed them within hours. The helicopter successfully rescued all 4 survivors, parents David and Sarah Chen, and their children Emma, age 14, and Michael, age 9, who were suffering from exposure and dehydration, but were expected to recover fully after medical treatment. Their yacht had struck an unmarked reef during the storm and sunk rapidly, leaving them with only their life raft and emergency supplies that would not have sustained them much longer in the deteriorating weather conditions. As Alice watched the Chen family being brought aboard the Enterprise for medical evaluation, 14-year-old Emma approached her and said simply, "You found us when no one else could hear our radio." 9-year-old Michael hugged Alice and told her, "You saved us," providing the kind of direct, honest gratitude that cut through all the psychological barriers Alice had built around her sense of worthlessness and failure. Commander Torres approached Alice privately and offered an apology that had been 15 years in the making. "Paul would have been proud of what you did today. He always said you were the best pilot he'd ever flown with. I didn't do it for recognition or redemption, Alice replied honestly, though she felt something shifting inside her that hadn't moved since Paul's death. That's exactly why Paul would have been proud, Torres said, offering the kind of closure that Alice had never expected to receive from anyone who had known Paul Morrison or witnessed the crash that had defined her life for a decade and a half. That night, Alice slept in an officer's berth aboard the Enterprise and experienced the first nightmare-free sleep she had enjoyed on a Navy ship since Paul's death, suggesting that confronting her past and using her skills to save lives had begun a healing process that she had thought was impossible. The next morning, as Alice prepared to depart in her repaired aircraft, a young ensign presented her with a package from the Chen family containing a child's drawing of her plane landing on the carrier deck, captioned, "Our angel who came from the storm." The takeoff from the Enterprise was smooth and uneventful, representing not just her departure from the ship, but her psychological transition from a pilot haunted by past failures to someone who had proven that her skills and courage could still make a difference when people needed help most. Alice understood that the Enterprise would always be the place where she had lost Paul Morrison, but it was now also the place where she had saved 4 lives and discovered that some burdens can only be carried differently, as reminders of growth and redemption rather than sources of shame and self-destruction. When Alice returned to her regular mail route, she taped Michael Chen's drawing to her instrument panel as a permanent reminder of why she flies and the good that can come from choosing courage over comfort when faced with opportunities to help others who are facing life-threatening situations. To the Chen family, Alice would always be the hero who appeared from the storm when all hope seemed lost, providing them with rescue and safety when death appeared certain. To Alice herself, the rescue had provided enough redemption for a lifetime, proving that pilots who have made mistakes can still find ways to honor their fallen wingman through actions that save lives and serve others who need help most. Sometimes the most important flights are not the ones that advance our careers or demonstrate our technical skills, but the ones that require us to confront our deepest fears and use our abilities to make a difference in ways that heal both ourselves and the people whose lives depend on our willingness to choose service over safety when faced with impossible decisions that define who we really are beneath our failures and regrets. We hope you enjoyed today's story of love, life, and betrayal. For more free stories and entertainment from our channel, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe with notifications.